Welcome to the French Tech Podcast here at the Hello Tomorrow conference, where we're exploring how deep tech can be leveraged to build a better future. Recording here at the beautiful Capitol Theatre in Singapore. And I'm very happy to welcome our next guest, Professor Peter Preiser. Welcome, sir.
Welcome. Thank you.
Could I ask you to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Peter Preiser. I'm a professor at the School of Biological Sciences at NTU, which is the Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. I'm also the lead PI of a Singapore MIT program which is specifically trying to tackle the issue of antimicrobial resistance.
So you just delivered a keynote here at the conference titled "The End of Working Antibiotics, What's Next?" A very ominous title, as I'm sure you'll agree. But perhaps some of our viewers aren't necessarily familiar with the problems around antibiotics. Could I ask you to elaborate on why the age of antibiotics might be coming to an end? And if so, what would be the consequences?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about this. So, if you think about it, until the middle of the last century, if you got a bacterial infection, there was very little one could do to treat it. You either were able to deal with the infection and survived, or you died, to be quite dramatic. And then in the 1930s, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, and the first antibiotic that then actually was used. And it was amazing because it ultimately relates to compounds that microbes make or small to fight other microbes. Now we can extract these chemicals that these microbes make, and they are fantastic because they only kill bacteria, but they don't kill human cells. So a very big difference between antibiotics and when you think about cancer therapy,
Right, yeah.
where you have a lot of side effects. The wonderful thing about antibiotics is that they don't have any side effects, or very little side effects. So they're very easy to use, they're easy on the body, and it's fantastic. And so with the discovery of Fleming of penicillin, there was this golden age where a lot of new antibiotics were discovered, and they were put into humans, and they really changed of how we deal with bacterial infections, and they had a really positive benefit in the sense that we were able to treat a lot of diseases which we weren't able to treat beforehand. Now, the interesting problem that isn't really a new problem is the fact that these antibiotics are made by microorganisms to kill other microorganisms. So these other microorganisms have developed mechanisms to fight off these compounds. And that's really where resistance, the ability to resist these chemicals, comes from. And so this has been around as long as microorganisms existed. So even Alexander Fleming recognized with the discovery of penicillin that it will be only a matter of time before new bacteria become resistant to these antibiotics. And that's really what we have been seeing, is that more and more of the antibiotics that we've discovered in that golden age, the bacteria becoming resistant to it, and what that means is you can't treat many things anymore. And while, as I said, even Alexander Fleming recognized this 70 years ago, it was a bit ignored because we had enough antibiotics, and there were new antibiotics coming on the marketplace, and we were always a little bit ahead. So there was resistance to penicillin, but we got vancomycin, or we got something else that helped us. But what has happened, and we've seen this happening in the last 10, 15 years, is that really bacteria are becoming resistant to every antibiotic that we have. And this in itself would not necessarily be the end of the world if we still would have new antibiotics. But what has happened in the last 30 years is really that we had that golden age of antibiotics, and then it stopped.
Right.
Too costly.
We didn't develop any more new antibiotics, and there are many reasons for it. It became more difficult. You got the low-hanging fruit.
Right, yeah.
So the question is, where does the next antibiotic come from? So that was one thing. The other thing is it became more and more expensive to put drugs on the market because of regulations, safety concerns, etc. So roughly in the 1970s, the numbers are to put an antibiotic on the market would have cost a company about $170 to maybe $200 million.
All right.
Now you're talking about over potentially $2 billion. And that's just the cost of literally getting the drug on the market. Antibiotics are normally used for short term. They are often used by people that have relatively low economic power or income. So it's not a big drug. The antibiotics are not something where you have a large profit margin.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to make money off antibiotics. And then there were some antibiotics which were developed, where resistance developed within months of the drug coming on the market.
Right.
So there were a lot of sort of disincentives to develop new antibiotics, and everyone sort of thought look, we got the problem solved anyway, we have enough, and we are fine. But as I said, in the last 10-15 years, we have come to the realization that we have, especially in hospitals, where people go in the hospital to have a minor procedure, and they acquire one of these multi-drug resistant infections in the hospitals, which potentially kill them, or even in the really massively extend the stay in hospital, because they need to deal with this infection. And so what is a little operation suddenly becomes a massive undertaking and has a huge cost and huge consequences.
A lot of death.
And death as well. So in the overall, we are talking about, at the moment, maybe direct consequences of microbial resistance, that the number of people that die of this is in around maybe 1 million. But what is the real worrisome projection is if we don't do something now, the projection is that by the year 2050, we have about more than 10 million people dying directly because of they have been infected with a resistant microbe that we can't treat anymore, which will be more than cancer. So it would be the highest mortality.
Right, it would not be the number one killer.
Yeah, it would be the number one killer. And while death is a tragic outcome, it's actually the bigger economic picture which underlies this, because death is, is one consequence. The fact of the matter is, if you have difficulty treating people with infections, they don't work, they cost.
Yes.
And there's been a number of studies which have tried to project the cost of this. And so the estimates are now that by the year 2050, antimicrobial resistance will have cost globally to the tune of $100 to $130 trillion.
Wow.
And that's such an astronomical number. I've always thought of, look, what does it relate to? That's actually 6 times the economy of the United States right now, annual economy. And that's a cost.
Right.
And inherent in this is that it will lead to a loss of between 2 to 3.5% of global GDP. These are staggering numbers, and one really needs to think about what we do about this, because it is something where, in an age when you don't have antibiotics, a lot of your standard procedures, elective procedure in hospitals would be not an option anymore. Cesareans you wouldn't do anymore, because the risk of acquiring a resistant infection and replacement of a hip or a knee, it would be, you wouldn't do that anymore, because it would become too risky to carry that out. Because if you go to a hospital now, even for the, you have a minor procedure, you're given some antibiotics for 5 days, and then you're fine.
Okay.
Now, if you don't give that antibiotic, you are actually, or you can't give it anymore. The risk of you picking up an infection, which then leads to an amputation or something, is astronomically high.
Can we avoid the resistance?
Well, I think there are some, it's not all doom and gloom. So the fact of the matter is, a lot of antibiotics still do work at this point in time, and we need to make sure that we protect what we have.
How do we do that?
Well, it's, one of the things you always hear, most people will have heard about, is only take antibiotics when you need antibiotics. Right. So if you have a viral infection, don't take antibiotics. Make sure that you you take the whole course of the antibiotic to make sure that you have. So there's a number of health recommendations that exist already that are aimed to reduce or protect the lifespan of these antibiotics further. But it's easier said than done, because a lot of times when somebody comes into to the doctor, they're not feeling well. So, there's a lot of pressure on doctors' time and so on. And they look at the symptoms and says, yes, this could be bacterial, it could be viral, but I don't know what the answer is, so I'll prescribe you an antibiotic as sort of an preemptive, just to make sure. What we need is ultimately, and this is sort of coming back, what might be some solutions, is we need to actually, the ability for someone to come to the doctor with some symptoms, and they have some way of diagnosing whether this is a microbial, whether it's a bacteria or whether it's a virus. And if it is a bacteria, is this already resistant to certain things or not, to tailor-make the treatment. And therefore allow, the small arsenal of drugs that we still have to work longer. But I think the bigger problem actually isn't necessarily what we do with humans and how we treat humans, it's actually how we produce food. The biggest use of antibiotics is actually not for treatment of humans.
Right.
It's actually to produce livestock. So in the United States, I think about 3/4 of all antibiotics used goes into the
3/4.
3/4.
Amazing.
Goes into the livestock production. And there, what is scary is that it's not even necessarily always used to treat infected animals, but it's used as a growth booster. So I think it's in the
What could possibly go wrong?
It's actually so bad that in certain parts in India, where they have a high concentration of livestock industry, the water in the rivers, so the runoff ultimately of this, has antibiotic concentrations which are higher than what you actually would give people to treat an infection.
Wow.
So I think there has to be a real rethink about how we use what antibiotics we have. I know in Europe it is now prohibited that, at least in some countries in Europe, to use antibiotics for growth enhancement of animals.
Yes.
So you can only use them really from
for the treatment of infection.
Treatment of
in those
infection.
animals. So to try to end this on a little bit of a positive note, is there any development in your field? So we're here at Hello Tomorrow. We're looking for innovations, breakthrough science, breakthrough technology to build a better future.
Yeah.
Are there any such developments that make you hopeful for the future?
Yes.
Thank you.
No, look. I think the most important start is actually to recognize that there's a problem. Once you recognize there is a problem, you can then think about what are some of the solutions. Now, first of all, I think there is already a realization at a governmental level, and that we need to figure out how to get how to change that whole drug development pipeline to get new antibiotics on the market. But there are also, because of the problems, there are novel and new thinking. So, for example, one of the things that I find is very exciting is to actually use biological warfare on bacteria, in the sense of that bacteria, like humans, get infected by viruses.
Mm-hmm.
These viruses are called bacteriophages. They are very specific that a certain bacteriophage only infects a certain type or species of the bacteria. When they infect the bacteria, what they do is they ultimately kill it. Well, it's a little bit like, when we get the flu, except for bacteria, which is a single cell. When the cell dies, that's it. And these bacteriophages we can manipulate and genetically engineer so that they become more specific to what we want to target and how we want to target. And it would put a very different challenge on microbes, any microbes, to develop resistance to bacteriophages also, once you have a bacteriophage that works, it's much easier to modify it a little bit and get it approved through a regulatory process than having a completely new chemical entity. So there might be a quicker way and a cheaper way of getting new bacteriophages into therapeutic use without having to spend $1 billion on safety. A little bit like our yearly influenza vaccine,
Right,
that is, it is using the same process, doing minor changes, and getting it therefore approved, because ultimately we have a safety perspective. And a new vaccine would take years and years to get on the market, but these minor modifications allow you to do this much faster, so we can have a seasonal vaccine. I think with phages, once we do have the technology, there is a way of very rapidly re-engineering phages to keep ahead of resistance.
Exactly.
So I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is really there is a lot of smart people out there in the world who, if they apply their intellect on tackling antimicrobial resistance, might come up with some really novel new approaches that we haven't even thought of about. Alexander Fleming stumbled on antibiotics by accident. We don't know. There might be some very unique way of bringing a solution together. It is ultimately a systems problem. There is a problem in how we use antibiotics, which is from a regulatory environment. There is a perspective of not having industry disengaged in the whole process.
Right.
And there's actually relatively little capacity even in the academic sector, because it was ignored. People thought microbes are done. We don't need to worry about infectious disease, especially bacteria, anymore. And so there's a loss of know-how. Some of the... But putting this, and it's been done at the highest level, WHO and so on, talking about antimicrobial resistance and these antimicrobial apocalypse, it's actually about focusing minds and putting the right components together.
Well, I'm happy to hear that you're at least somewhat optimistic for the future, and I share your belief that if we can focus all of these bright minds in the world and manage to create the right economic incentives to bring these new types of treatment to market, then certainly we could come up with a way to not all collectively die because of the end of the age of
Well, I would very much hope that we don't do this.
Well, thank you very much for sharing these insights, taking the time to talk to us here today. I hope you're having fun here at the Hello Tomorrow conference.
Yes, it's a lot of fun, and I'm learning a lot, and it's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.